Hey, it's Dave Brown here, host of Now with Dave Brown on AMI. Check out this latest highlight from the show. Just yesterday on the show, we were talking about being creative, specifically how the pandemic has given some creative folks the opportunity to hone their skills and try new things. Maybe you've picked up an instrument or taken an online class in the last 18 months, or maybe you've been like me and spent more time than usual staring blankly at a wall. Does that qualify as meditation? Anyway, what about the creative types who are already entrenched in their craft? How did a radical shift in the world impact their process? Waubgeshig Rice is an author and journalist. His award-winning novel, Moon of the Crusted Snow, is available at Amazon, Indigo, and Apple Books. You can also find the audio version on Audible or find the accessible formats at the Center for Equitable Library Access. And Wab joins us this morning. Hey, Wab, thank you so much for making time to be with us today. We're so appreciative.
Oh, hey, Dave. Thanks a lot for having me. Great to chat with you.
Yeah, great to chat with you too. So, Wab, let's actually go back in time a little bit here because you've worked as a journalist and you've done creative writing for a long, long time. But what made you finally, a couple of years ago, finally put pen to paper, fingertip to keyboard, and start writing novels?
Well, I think it was a passion I had since I was a teenager, just from being an avid reader and then being exposed to Indigenous authors back in my youth. Having that door open for me really showed me that Indigenous experiences could thrive in literature. And, being in high school in the 90s, that was something I didn't see at all because, so-called marginalized authors weren't in the Ontario curriculum at all, right? But fortunately, I had relatives and friends who showed me all about Indigenous authors. So it's something that had always been with me, a desire I'd always had. And when I think my journalism career got going in sort of my mid-20s, I still had this wish to, fulfill that other creative process I had lingering in the back of my head. So I had, these short stories that I'd written when I was a kid, and I sought out trying to get them published, towards my late 20s or so. And I just spent all my free time outside of the newsroom because I was working full-time at CBC by then. Just writing, about these experiences, about, the stories I imagined from Indigenous communities, particularly inspired by my own. And those turned into my first short story collection about 10 years ago, actually. So, yeah, I think for me it was just, a dream to always become published. And I feel so fortunate that it became true.
Moon of the Crusted Snow, your most recent novel, got quite a bit of acclaim, and one of the things that people really liked about it is the vivid world that it created. Even though the story itself is post-apocalyptic, how did you craft a universe that was so detailed like that felt so real?
Oh, thanks for that, Dave. It was largely inspired by growing up in Anishinaabe First Nation. I'm from Wissahickon First Nation, which is near Parry Sound, Ontario, on Georgian Bay. So I think the cultural and social dynamics of the story itself were inspired by what I saw growing up there in the 1980s and 1990s. The particular community traits, the nuances of dialogue, the family dynamics and so on. I'd seen all of that growing up. However, in Moon of the Crusted Snow, the fictional community in that story is in far northern Ontario. And that is not my reality, of course. I'm from a community that's only a 2-hour drive north of Toronto, right? So not isolated by any stretch of the imagination. But, I was fortunately able to draw from a lot of the stories I did while I was working at CBC. I covered a lot of stories in northern Ontario and northern Manitoba. But on top of that, I felt I had to do some due diligence in really consulting with some friends and acquaintances who are from so-called remote communities, right? Fly-in communities. And when I was working on earlier drafts, I asked them to read them and offer feedback about, the accuracy of that life. So yeah, it was part my own experience, but also a big part additional research. And I think with fiction, you really have to get those details right. And you have to tell those community stories properly and respectfully, not just to create a good relationship with other Indigenous communities, but also to reflect those truths in a good way for non-Indigenous people who are learning about these realities at the same time. So a lot of work went into it for sure.
The novel received some critical praise from some pretty notable critical places. It also made a lot of shortlists, which is super cool. The other thing that jumped out at me is that it made even like the Reddit book club book of the month. So it really shows that your book was connecting with both the literary community, but as well as just sort of readers in general. How affirming is it that the novel received this much recognition at this point in your writing career?
Oh, I was not expecting that at all. I am still blown away, overwhelmed by that praise, by the fact that so many people in so many different communities around the world have connected with that story. I'm very grateful always to the readers who, continue to encourage me to write as a result of this story. Yeah, I didn't anticipate it, becoming a bestseller. I didn't anticipate it, receiving much critical acclaim. I started working as a host for CBC, as a radio host, shortly before the book was released. And I sort of anticipated that, okay, this is going to be my last fiction work for a while because I have this great job as a radio host. And I'm gonna,
the daily grind. I know something about that daily grind, Wob.
Yeah. Yeah, so I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to stick with this daily grind for a few years to come, and then maybe I'll, jump back into the fiction world in maybe 5-10 years' time. But because Moon of the Crusted Snow took off in the way it did, I ultimately left my job at CBC because I had an opportunity to work on the sequel for it, which is what I'm doing right now.
Right. I was going to say that according to your website, there's some big news for fans. So tell us about what's happening with the sequel and what it's like revisiting a world that you've already created as a writer.
It's really fun and it's unexpected because when I finished Moon of the Crusted Snow, I was like, okay, I'm done with this story. The characters rode off into the sunset for me in some ways, right? But thanks to the response it got, when I was out on the road doing events and readings and so on, people started asking me from the beginning if there was going to be a sequel. And at first I was saying, no, there's not, because I didn't plan on it. And then after responding that way a few times, I felt kind of bad because I realized that people want more of this story. And these are the people, buying my book and supporting me. And I at least owe them some consideration anyway. So I changed my tune slightly as the months went on and said, okay, well, I wasn't really considering it, but I'll start thinking about it. And then in the summer of 2019, my agent, Denise Bukowski, she said, the book's still selling well. You should put some serious thought into writing a sequel. And I'll try to find you a publishing deal for that. So, I started kicking around some ideas in my head, not really sure about what a sequel would be. Then as the months went on, she was able to find me a home for a potential second story at Penguin Random House. And I started having talks with an editor there named Rick Meyer. He's who I'm working with right now. And we sort of started building out the story then. And I guess enhancing the world that was created in the first book, which was super fun to do. The hardest part was figuring out a point of tension, right? Because it's so clear in the first book what the conflict is. But in the second book, it's like, okay, how are we going to make this? What are the stakes, essentially, in the second part of the story? So just to recap quickly, it's going to be 10 years in the future. Many of the characters are still going to be around, and what they're going to do is seek out the world to the south to try to find out what happened at the end of the world and try to reconnect with their traditional homelands on the Georgian Bay shoreline. So it's going to be called Moon of the Turning Leaves, and it's slated for publication in the fall of 2022. Very
cool. Wob, I'm curious about your process, because since you started working on this, a lot's changed in the world. We're having a lot of conversations. There's important events and stories that are swirling around us. And I want to start with the pandemic, how that's changed how a lot of artists are approaching their work. How did it impact the way that you're working on your stuff?
Well, it's interesting because as the pandemic really intensified is when I quit my job at CBC. So for the first time, I had all kinds of full-time scheduling to work on fiction. So it was an adjustment for me anyway. But, when we were considering the plot details of the story, Rick and I, there was originally going to be a significant plague element in the second part, but as the pandemic got worse, we thought, okay, people might not necessarily want to read about another sickness in a story, right? So we sort of modified that a little bit. And then as, last summer unfolded, I had a lot of time to sort of develop the story a little bit more. The biggest challenge really was when school went online for our older son. He was able to start kindergarten in the classroom last fall, But by the time the winter rolled around, as we know, there were widespread lockdowns here in Ontario. So that was a big challenge, figuring out what my writing routine was going to be, because I spent most of the day with him, trying to help him with his online learning, right? So I had to shift gears a little bit, but it was more or less like going back to what I used to do when I worked full time, and that was work on my fiction in the evening, So when he and his little brother were in bed, that's when I really started writing again. So it was like, it was just a reminder to be flexible as a creative, and most creatives have full-time jobs anyway, and I did for a long time. And I'm really fortunate now that I can do fiction work full-time, right? So yeah, but I had to remind myself just to be flexible and go back to that old routine.
Waub, I understand this question may be a little bit inelegant, but how does the recent conversation, at least the magnified conversation about reconciliation, colonial legacy, and the residual colonial impact form your work, especially considering that in Moon of the Crusted Snow, there is a strong allegory to a colonial impact?
Oh, that's not an inelegant question at all, Dave. That's totally relevant to all the work I do. Pretty much, I think what I try to form and create as a writer or storyteller is a direct response to colonialism. It really defines who I am as an Indigenous person, and how I react to it really is going to be my personal legacy, whether I'm in a professional sense or a personal sense or whatever else, right? So yeah, Moon of the Crusted Snow very much is an allegory for colonialism. It follows a community that's been displaced, that endures a world-ending blackout, and then gets visited by unwanted escapees from the South, from the city, right? So then you see this cycle of colonialism repeating as these settlers from the South try to impose their will upon this community. But everything is connected. All these themes and issues are tied together. It's from residential schools to the 60s scoop to loss of language and culture and so on. That's all a result of Indigenous people being displaced and then brutalized by a colonial system. So fortunately, we're in a time now where many more Indigenous people are empowered to speak their truths, to share their stories in different media, in different realms, in different professional capacities. And we have opportunities like this to share those truths, and I think it's really important that other Canadians continue to listen. And really, we're only seeing now widespread recognition of these horrors, right? It's unfortunately taken the evidence of, a grave tally at these residential school sites across the land. But, Indigenous people have been talking about these things for a long time. I've known about graves at residential schools since I was a little kid, right? That's just our reality. We know these horrible truths about our existence. But, now Canadians are taking these things seriously, which is good. I just hope that, Canadians don't forget about these discussions we're having this summer.
Yeah, that we don't just move on after the news stories or the news cycle dies down a little bit. Yeah. Waub, I've long admired your work as a broadcaster and journalist as your colleague, and it's been really great to see you emerge as a writer as well and spread those wings as well. So it's been a pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you for making time to be with us.
Oh, Dave, thanks a lot for having me. Great to chat with you, my friend. Great to see your show. Big fan, so keep up the great work.
Oh, thanks. Really appreciate the kind words. That's Waubgeshig Rice. He's an author and journalist. His award-winning novel, Moon of the Crusted Snow, is available on Amazon, Indigo, Apple Books, and of course, you can find an audio version on Audible, and the accessible format's also available at the Center for Equitable Library Access. Do you want to dive into more conversations like this? Watch Now with Dave Brown weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on AMI TV or download the podcast wherever you listen.